And we are live. So hello to everyone that has tuned in. Thank you for coming along to our panel discussion. So today we are going to be talking about mental health and horror. We're going to be discussing comfort in fear. Interesting choice, but we'll get into that a little bit more. This is for Mental Health Awareness Week, which is this week. Obviously a really, really important topic to be talking about. And I think, just through my own experiences, I've found that horror has been such an amazing outlet for processing trauma, grief, difficult emotions, and put out a call on Twitter, and it seemed like that just resonated with so many people in the horror community. So here we are with an amazing lineup of guests, and we are going to be discussing everything about horror, mental health, and just kind of being quite open and honest. Obviously, do drop in the comments anything you want. But yeah, I guess we're going to get into it. I've done enough babbling. So I'm going to go round and get everyone to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with May. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
So yeah, I'm May Murray. I'm a certified peer specialist working in Boston, Massachusetts. It's a really unique role in the mental health field where your expertise is your own life, and you kind of use your healing and your experience of trauma to help others. So I work with kids ages 12 to 19 who are just coming out of psychiatric treatment and are transitioning to a group home setting before going home to their families. And then on the other side, that's kind of like my day job. And then on the other side of that, I'm a freelance writer. I write fiction and nonfiction, and my special interest is horror.
Thank you, May. And over to you, Dolly.
Hi, I'm a Golly Miss Dolly, which is my cabaret and burlesque name. My real name's Igraine, just in case nobody wanted to call me a Golly Miss Dolly. As said, I'm a cabaret artist, pin-up model, burlesquer. I'm also the host of a horror movie podcast called What a Scream. And when I'm not flinging me clothes off on stage, I am a mother. That's basically what I do.
Thank you. And Mal?
Hi, I'm Mal. I'm generally a movie lover, to be fair, but I've recently discovered my own sort of mental health journey. Bit of a mental health advocate online, and in my own personal life, mental health champion at work as well. But at the same time, I'm a bit of a horror film buff as well. Try to go to as many festivals and events as I can do. But for me, it's more so about just trying to make sure that the mental health discussions happen across the board wherever I can be, and promote that as much as I can, really.
Thanks, Mal. Tim?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Coleman. I'm a freelance writer for outlets like Total Film and Jump Cut Online, specializing again in horror, and also run a genre site, movingpicturesfilmclub.com. Alongside that, my day job is that I'm a lecturer at the University of Warwick, lecturing on topics like mental health, social justice, and working and supporting with vulnerable groups.
Thanks, Tim. Jen?
Hi, I'm Jen Adams, and I'm a writer and podcaster from Nashville. And in my day job, I write curriculum, mostly elementary curriculum, with kind of a focus on DEI and inclusivity. And by night, I am the co-host of the Losers Club podcast, which is about Stephen King, and also the Psychoanalysis podcast, which is looking at horror movies through the lens of mental health. So we take a topic like PTSD and talk about a movie that we see that represented in. And I also write, I tend to write a lot about mental health and just the way that I see it represented in horror. So.
Thanks, Jen. And last but certainly not least, Lakea, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Lakea. I'm a recent MA Gender Studies graduate, and in September I'll be doing my PhD with a focus on ferocious fatherhood of the 1980s and 90s in horror film, but also I take a really keen interest in masculinity and mental health.
Thank you, Lakea. So that is our amazing panelist of guests today. So we are going to kick off with some questions. So my first kind of question is, why do you guys think there's such a strong correlation between horror and mental health? I'm going to start with you, May.
It's hard to say because, and I think that this is probably going to come up later, but it's not like a one size fits all. So it's not what's helpful for me isn't going to be helpful for someone else. But I can say that for me, you know, I'm a survivor of a lot of trauma that began in my early childhood. And some of those things, I think of them in my mind as kind of unspeakable or unthinkable, like some of the things that I've witnessed. And so when I watch horror movies, you know, it really depends on the horror movie, what I'm getting out of it, because sometimes you just watch them for fun. The Guest is one of those I watch over and over just because it's hilarious. But then there are other movies that I'm in, if I'm in a mood where I'm like, I really need to find something that represents how I'm feeling right now. And sometimes the things that I've seen and witnessed are so horrible that the only thing that can compare is a horror film. And so I think that that's what the interest is, honestly. And I found that in my work with teenagers as well. There's just this kind of feeling of this media, which is horrific, it like resonates so much with the pain and the fear that I felt in my life. But it's a controlled way to witness that, and a very controlled way to take a step back and just witness it kind of happening to these characters that it really doesn't affect you in any way.
Absolutely. I think for me that control is very, very important, because I don't like being out of control. So that certainly helps. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with May. I think there's something true about being able to experience these emotions within the safety of a 90-minute film. And I think if we talk about the kind of things that drive issues with mental health, like trauma, for example. So things like trauma and abuse and difficult life experiences, those also tend to be the topics which are the natural territory for horror films. Like horror films' bread and butters are things like violence, they are things like survival, they are things like wrestling with past experiences. And so I think there's a natural overlap, like probably more than any other genre. Horror is tooled up to kind of address and wrestle with these topics because there is such a thematic crossover.
Definitely. I mean, I always think there's not many rom-coms that kind of tackle trauma too well, do they?
Yeah, and I think sometimes when people are not in the horror community, they will maybe ask, like, why would you want to watch something like this? And I think it's a legitimate question. I don't want to shut anyone down who asks that question, but I think there's sometimes a difficulty to understand the level of catharsis and processing that happens within the safety of a horror film that's afforded, like actually being able to talk about and work through very difficult things, which I'm in the UK society is not great about talking about things like trauma and abuse and survival. So having a platform where you're able to have those discussions and to think constructively and to have a language to interpret your own experiences is really, really powerful and really useful.
Yeah, definitely. And Lakea, what about you?
I think for me, why I love horror films as well so much is when you have a mental illness, sometimes your life is literally horror. It literally becomes a horror. So when I think of things like The Haunting of Hill House, for example, you guys have seen, or is it a representative of what she's seeing in her head and her mental state, and just being able to see and process, May and Tim were saying, you can actually resonate with it through that 90-minute thing rather than dealing with it yourself. It's oh wow, other people have been through this too, or they're going through this too, and it's a really kind of liberating thing, I think.
Yeah, I think it's it's definitely liberating in many ways, and obviously certain films in particular. What about you, Dolly?
For me personally, I grew up in rural Ireland, very, 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 very Catholic. And if you kind of stepped outside the line, you were very ostracized, and I was heavily bullied for it. And for me, horror was always about the outcast and the monster. Well, the horror that I got into initially, which was the monster horrors, you know, Frankenstein, Dracula. And it was all about the outcast, and it was all about the monsters. And when you go through all this bullying and you're also a queer person, you kind of resonate a lot with the monster, and it's like you find a comfort in these films that show these monsters that they're meant to be the bad person, but when you look at these films, it's actually the people that are the bad person rather than the monster, or they've made the monster, or through other people's actions, this is why someone is being monstrous. And I really resonated with that side of the horror, that it really kind of spoke to me, that I felt myself, I was a monster. And then on top of that, when you're also dealing with mental illnesses, like Aya said, you also feel like you're in a horror film. And so it's just this kind of like, you just kind of resonate with these characters. And that's why I think I'm so passionate about horror, and why if I'm having a shit day, I go in and I watch horror, you know?
Yeah, and those monsters, you know, it's like we grow up and, you know, we're meant to be scared of the monsters, but like you said, you know, I think a lot of the times we actually resonate with them more so than the humans in the films. What about you, Mal?
Yeah, for me, it's a similar sort of thing to what everyone's saying. A lot of it is around my own personal experiences. So the bullying thing, again, comes up for me, where I look at some films, especially where there's a film like Starry Eyes stands out to me, and another film called Cruel Summer, where that almost awareness of yourself and that change within yourself. So horror for me becomes a thing that calms my brain, because I see everything that I'm either experiencing or have experienced or may feel on the screen in front of me, and it's all there for me to watch. And it almost sort of says, look, you're not in this alone. We're portraying everything for you in front of you, but it's okay. It's not real. The film isn't real. Your feelings aren't, you know, are what they are, but it's okay. So I'll get comfort from that. And I think for me, I can then almost compartmentalize my brain and say I can deal with things a certain way because I've seen it on screen. So for me, it's that calmingness. I think the other day I was having a crappy day. I went to the gym. It didn't work out great at the gym, and I came home. I thought I'll put a horror film on, and I was at peace almost. So that's how my relationship works with horror films.
Yeah, they do. It's funny, isn't it? You wouldn't typically think horror would bring us peace, but you know, that's why we're all here talking about horror and it bringing us peace. And what about you, Jen?
I think about, I've since I was a little, I've always kind of been drawn to like scary stuff. And I think I've realized in the last couple of years that I grew up in a really emotionally abusive home, but there was never anything I could put my finger on. Like there wasn't like an event or something. And so I was just always afraid, and I didn't understand why. And it's really only been in the last couple of years that I've started to figure that out. But horror gave me like a face to put on that fear, you know, and it gave me like something to channel it through and to process it. And even though I wasn't really processing the thing I was actually afraid of, which was my dad, like I could process something. Like I was afraid of the monster in the movie. And, you know, if I watched a Final Girl, like I could like put myself in her shoes and get kind of a little bit of strength from that. So I think that has really just kind of helped me channel a lot of my feelings.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess for many of us, you know, those kind of Final Girls, they're also, you know, been a driving force, and amazing kind of characters to see on screen. And you know, I think you guys all really nailed there kind of many of the different reasons why horror just goes hand in hand with mental health, and you know, kind of dealing with a lot of personal demons and all of those things. So I'm quite keen to hear from you all kind of what are the horror films or TVs or even books, you know, that were the most poignant in your life. What kind of, you know, really made a difference to you? And I'm gonna go back to you, Jen.
Well, okay, there's two that really stand out. And the first one is the Babadook. And I think the reason that I really connected with that one, and I'm not going to spoil it in case anyone hasn't seen it, but the way that the story goes, that really kind of helped me understand that like my mental illness is not something that's ever going to go away. I'm going to learn how to manage it. And I just love, like, that was an inspiring thing for me to see. And the other one is the Poughkeepsie Tapes, which I have just really been drawn to recently. I actually wrote a piece for Ghouls that's going to be out soon. But I've read that piece in therapy twice now, and I've only cried the first time. But it's just that was really helped me understand the emotional abuse I think that I had suffered, and like what it did or what it caused, like the ripple effects that it caused for the rest of my life that I'm still dealing with. So.
Yeah, I mean, the Poughkeepsie Tapes, it's a tough film as well. So I can absolutely see, why it's one that brings up a lot of emotions and a lot of resonance with. And also, the Babadook was a film that when I put the call out, so many people mentioned the Babadook as a fantastic example. What about you, Dolly?
For me, the Babadook as well, because I'd had a child, and I'd suffered a lot from depression and anxiety before having the child. But then when I had the child, I suffered from really, really horrific postnatal, to the point where like I just wanted to kill myself. And we're fed this constant messages of when you become a parent, and especially as someone who's given birth, you're meant to, it's meant to be fairies and unicorns, and you're meant to be like Mother Earth, and you love your child and everything's perfect, when in reality you literally just want to scream. And it's like just the way that parenthood was portrayed in the Babadook, I was like, oh my God, someone else gets it, especially when you're also going through an illness and depression. You're like, I thought I was the only one, but the Babadook really displayed how it is to have postnatal and trauma and not deal with it. And like Jen said, it has this great thing where it's like, it's always going to be there and it's always something you have to deal with. You just have to feed it every now and then. That, and also Saw. I know it's a bit of a strange one, but before I'd kind of become a mother and got into burlesque and cabaret, I was very low, very into like self-harm, whether it be alcohol or actual physical self-harm. And I think Saw was just that emotional kick in the arse that you kind of get, that you're like, oh shit, I have dragged myself down to this such low point that I now need to work on getting myself up. As weird as that sounds to resonate with Saw.
Funny enough, actually, a couple of other people mentioned Saw, and personally, I turned to very extreme porn movies, so I absolutely get that kind of vibe. What about you, Mal?
Yeah, I think I mentioned on Dolly's Instagram question the other day about a couple of films. So the one that sticks out for me mostly, obviously, The Shining. I resonate a lot with that, just the way he broke down, and I've been sort of in places where I've just broken down and I can't handle what's going on. Final Destination is another one that resonates with me quite a lot because of the inevitability of stuff, where sometimes you just haven't got control over your mental health, you haven't got control over things, and then that inevitable nature of that film just sort of just again calms me down. But I think the one that I posted up was Martyrs. I know Martyrs is a bit extreme, but for me, Martyrs, like I said, I think I responded back saying people see a lot of that depravity and violence, but I see empathy in that film, because there's a lot that they're going through that I know that there's that level of hurt almost, and I don't know how to explain exactly in exact words how I visualize that film, but when I watch it, I just feel a lot more like calmer about my mental health. And Martyrs pushes the right sort of extreme buttons. Saw's another one, I suppose, in the same sort of vein for me, where I do feel that there's an extremeness going on in front of me that just puts everything into perspective.
Yeah, Martyrs is again, a very tough movie. But I think you're right when you say about empathy. There's a lot of emotion, and there's so much in that film. I mean, it's it does take it out of you for sure, but yeah, Martyrs is a fantastic example. And what about you, Lakea?
So for me, I think, well, there's two that I really resonated with. The first one is Midsummer, if anyone's seen that. I didn't know what to expect going into that film. I thought it was some kind of like weird fairy tale. I don't know. But by the ending, I was just like, wow, like that smile on the actress's face at the end, like just being free of toxicity and letting go and going through that emotional journey. Like, I really resonated with that. It was a beautiful performance. And then also another one, which is kind of strange, but I don't know, is Before I Wake, if any of you guys have seen that. There's a little boy in it, and he's terrified of this thing called the Cankerman, and it literally comes alive because his dreams come alive. And it kind of turns out in the end that it was kind of his manifestation of his mom having cancer, and in her last days she looked really, really poorly, and that's kind of how it manifested for him. And like seeing someone you love kind of deteriorate, it's heartbreaking, and sometimes you don't always know how to handle those emotions, especially when you're not of the emotional maturity to understand what's going on. So for me, that was like huge, because when I love got really, really sick, and it was just kind of hard to handle all the emotions that I had at the time. So that was a beautiful film for me. I cried watching it. So yeah.
Yeah, that film's I agree with you. One of my traumas was when my mum passed away of terminal breast cancer, and that for me was a point where a lot of films I suddenly went, oh, this resonates. And yeah, Before I Wake, I think it presents it in a really interesting way as well. I think from a child's point of view as well, kind of the element of not really understanding, but that even comes through as an adult. We still find it tough to process those things. What about you, May?
I'm seeing in the chat that Shay has said Midsummer and Hereditary, both for different reasons. So I just want to start with that, because those are two that I would say. But I can pinpoint specific parts in the films that were really impactful for me. So Midsummer, it's everyone who has seen it knows, starts out with a very significant loss for the main character. A couple of years ago, my father passed away. He was an alcoholic, and it was, I won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but it was a very bad death, and I was there for the last 24 hours before he passed. So not long after Hereditary came out, and then Midsummer came out. Hereditary, I remember I saw it in theaters, and I was the only one in there, so it was actually quite terrifying, because I still think that's the scariest movie I've ever seen in theaters. But yeah, the moment when the boy is in the car and the thing happens that's very shocking, when he drives back home, the look on his face was like everything that I was feeling at that moment. This sort of trauma, numb trauma reaction where you just you're shaking and you're sweating and you don't know what to do. That was kind of how I felt at that time. In Midsummer, the screaming scene, that was so much what I have felt in my journey of trying to deal with the grief of the loss of my dad. Then I had another one. Oh, okay. So the new Pet Sematary, I also saw in theaters. I really like to see movies in theaters by myself, in the middle of the day when no one's there. So all of these movies, that's how I saw them. And I know that there were a lot of criticisms of the new Pet Sematary, but that one really came out right after my dad died. And so when I went to see it, and of course I've seen the original too, but because of the time that it came out, when I went to see it, it made me think about, you know, the lengths that we would go to preserve a person in our lives, to keep them with us, just to have that like physical connection. And, you know, of course, the whole point of the film is that that's not really his daughter or his son anymore. But what would you do to keep a person in your life, regardless of whether or not that person was exactly as you remembered them? And I found myself like in that moment thinking, like, maybe because I think people would think, what the hell is this guy doing? Like, why the hell would he do that? But like, for me, I was like, if I had the opportunity, maybe I would, because that's how much the pain hurts, you know? Yeah, I don't know how long I've been talking, but that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually really agree on the Pet Sematary. I mean, I really liked the remake. I thought it was a very good remake. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, and I think that's, you know, a theme we see always coming back in horror is, you know, bringing people from the dead or keeping them, you know, whether they're kind of like a zombie or a dead body or around, because it's like, it's, you know, it's hard for us to let people go. I mean, that's just kind of, you know, how it is. What about you, Tim?
So for me, it's probably two films. The first one we've already spoken about, which is Jennifer Kent's The Babadook. I think my experience with that film was I lost both my parents quite close together, one after the other over the last 5 years. And after my dad died, a friend of mine who had lost both his parents said to me, like, have you seen The Babadook? And I knew of it, I hadn't seen it, but I thought, okay, maybe then now's the time to give it a go. And for me, it was almost like, and Jen kind of touched on this already, like the ending for me was almost like an epiphanic revelation about learning to live with something. Because I think there's this mythology, we talk about grief, loss and bereavement, that you bounce back from things, which is completely untrue. Like you never bounce back from those kind of things. You learn to live with it and you learn to survive. And maybe because I'm a guy, I don't want to generalize that guys are generally bad with their emotions. I can say that me personally, I'm not very good at articulating my emotional landscape, and something very much I'm working on. But the Babadook kind of gave me a language to talk about it and to conceptualize it and to visualize it, and was really helpful. The second film, which is kind of similar thematically, was Issa Lopez's Tigers Are Not Afraid. And I mean, Issa Lopez has said publicly that film's about saying goodbye to your mother. She made it to say goodbye to her mum, who she lost when she was a child. And perhaps this is a bit like oversharing, I don't know. I watched it because when my mum died, she was in hospital for 2 weeks, pretty much in a coma, and so I was with her the whole time. But you know, people in comas don't make great conversationalists, so I was holding her hand and talking to her, and then watching movies on my phone and my iPad. And one of those I watched was Tigers Are Not Afraid. And so for me, that may be an example where from the outside people looking, people would go, why would you do that? Why would you watch a film about saying goodbye to your mother while you're saying goodbye to your own mother? But for me, it was such a cathartic and therapeutic experience to actually be able to have something, you know, that's a fantastical Del Toro-esque narrative, which invokes, you know, realism alongside these kind of monstrous ghosts. But for me, it was like the perfect film at the perfect time. And so for me, like those two films very much have been part of my grieving process, and my journey to finding a way of becoming more emotionally intelligent and kind of learning the topography of my own emotions.
And it's really interesting that you said there about, you know, a lot of people often say, why would you watch something like that going through a tough time? I mean, you know, I like very extreme movies, and a lot of people often say to me, like, why would you watch, you know, like an hour of someone just being kind of like tortured and dismembered? And I felt, you know, after various traumas that I kind of was like numb inside, you know, and I didn't know how you could kind of explain to someone feeling numb, but also pain at the same time. So I ended up watching, you know, films like Guinea Pig, Flowers of Flesh and Blood, which is pure torture. But for me, I was like, that kind of represents, the pain that I'm feeling. Is it feels like I'm being constantly tortured. And I might not suggest that movie to a lot of people because it's but for me that kind of really was very comforting in a messed up way.
But I think there's something, isn't there, about like people are not, and again, generalizing massively, but I think there's a cultural aversion to pain and confronting pain and talking about pain. And what horror does so well is it puts it front and center and says, "No, you're gonna look at it." And I think it's probably, for my money, the most honest genre because, like you described there, Zoe, like the experience, the emotional reality of going through trauma is so difficult that actually seeing something represented through physical trauma in a film like Martyrs, like Guinea Pig, like Saw, it is a way of almost making peace with those emotions. I love that, like Mal brought up Martyrs as well. It's one of my favorites too. But there's kind of extreme films like Martyrs, something like Miike's films as well. Like these are films which there's almost like a transcendental, almost spiritual quality to them, particularly Martyrs, which is part of the third act.
Yeah,
just want to. Sorry, I was going to jump in on that, Zoe, to say on the flip side, there's a film called Swallow, which I saw recently as well, where I don't know if you've seen it, where the main protagonist, she ends up like swallowing objects around the house as a cry for help, and that did it in the opposite way for me because it was almost like, well, I've got no outlet here, I'm being oppressed. She's going through all this thing at home, and that was her cry for help. And for me, again, that just resonated so much because sometimes you're so numb with your anxiety or your stress or your depression, whatever you're suffering, you've got no way of saying, help me. And that put it front and center, as you said, Tim, for me to just look at it and think, yeah, I get that. I can resonate with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Swallow was a fantastic film, actually. I think the last scene really, I mean, it's quite subtle in what it shows. I'm not going to give any spoilers for anyone that hasn't seen it. But it got me. I was like, fuck, that's a powerful kind of ending scene. And on the flip side, do you guys ever think that horror is potentially bad for mental health? What do you think, Mal?
I think it can be if it taps into your own personal insecurities or your own personal fears and traumas. Like since I've had kids, I can't watch stuff with kids in it where they get hurt, killed, anything like that, and it could be the most non-violent film, but if a kid's getting hurt, I'm like, that's hit me differently. I'm happy watching someone get their head chopped off, but a little kid getting hurt is completely different. So for me, that probably kicks in. And I think also stuff that is, I suppose, extreme for the sake of extreme or exploitative for the sake of it, that has no resonance for me. That doesn't make sense either, because then that can just tap into other parts of your brain, which when you're looking at a film, especially a horror film, if you know what you're in for, it's different. Like Saw, you know what it's going to expect. But if you go into a film and think, actually, this isn't doing me any good, by watching this sort of film, it's making me feel worse. I need to switch it off. I can't handle how I'm already feeling. Then that can't help. And there are various genres that would probably fit to that. But I think that kind of personal. For me, I like found footage is one that I can't work with. As a genre, because that anxiety of being, just following that camera around and not knowing what's around the corner and not being able to sort of be in control of your actions, I can't do well with found footage films for that reason.
They're also bloody terrifying when they want to be. What about you, Jen?
Yeah, I think that I don't necessarily say I would think that horror in general is ever bad for anyone, and that's something that we were talking about on a recent episode. Like, it's not going to make your mental health worse, but I think it's a personal decision about what you are really ready to experience. Like, I love the Babadook, but I had to watch it 3 times before I could finish, because I also had really young kids, and I was like, I can't go here right now. And even a movie like The Guest, which I love, but there are times when, like, the beginning of it, because they're mourning someone, I was like, I just can't do this right now. And so I think that that's where you really just have to listen to yourself and see what is resonating, and is this an emotional ride that I'm ready to go on right now?
Yeah, definitely. Lakea?
That's really interesting what Jen's just said, actually, because to this day I still haven't watched Get Out. because of the whole racial tensions and things, and I just know that I'm not ready with the whole BLM and everything that's going on. I know that it would trigger a part of me that would evoke an emotional response. So I just haven't gone there yet. But I would say for me personally, I think some films can be quite triggering. For example, I Spit on Your Grave. I can't, I cannot, because I think it's just exaggerated for exaggerated's sake. Like, it's so explicit. I just can't even finish watching like that scene. Because like as a woman as well, I don't think there's like, I think it's every 1 in 2 women that have faced some form of sexual assault or harassment or anything like that, and it's just hard to watch that sometimes because that is the reality of so many women, and it's quite sad. And I would say the other one for me was Gerald's Game. I didn't expect it to trigger me as much as it did, but there was a particular scene where the child is like kind of being sexually abused by her dad, or it was disgusting. I couldn't believe it. I literally had to get up and leave, and I don't know if that's because I've got siblings or I don't know, right? But it just wasn't very nice to watch. Like what Mal was saying, you don't necessarily want to watch that when you're a big sister, or because it just makes you worry. And I don't like that feeling. So yeah, they were my 2.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, you know, I Spit on Your Grave as a film. You know, some people I've heard, you know, very similar opinions to you. You know, whereas for me, I find it like one of the most cathartic films ever, and I've seen it on numerous occasions. And I love the rape revenge genre. It really, you know, I find it empowering, but I also can look at it and go, there's a lot of triggering content in there, which, you know, absolutely, like, you know, don't go near it if it's not your kind of thing. What about you, Dolly?
I think for me, it kind of depends on who is making the film. So, like, if we take I Spit on Your Grave, I find it very male gazy. Whereas something like Violation, which has just come out on Shudder, I find that very true to the female gaze of what could happen during a sexual assault. And so I find stuff like I Spit on Your Grave quite triggering, and it just feels like it's not meant for survivors, for me personally. Another thing, yeah, I can't watch anything with kids. That really freaks me out. I just finished Them, the series on Amazon Prime, and there's a really horrible scene there, and I had nightmares for days. And usually with my nightmares, I'm like, whoa, that was really cool, you know, whereas these nightmares, I was like, nope. So yeah, a lot of the time, you know what, I'd really like some trigger warnings on films. That would be really great if films could put that up, because like others have said, sometimes you just cannot deal with that kind of thing. Another one, there's a film called Devil's Doorway. It's an Irish film, and it's set in the Magdalen Laundries. And for anyone who doesn't know, Ireland has this really bad history with how it treats women and children. And when I first saw that film, I just almost couldn't deal with it, because we were still going through a really rough patch here in Ireland where abortion was illegal, and we were trying to make it legal. And so, yeah, I definitely think it depends on what you're going through at that moment. Yeah, whereas now I can watch The Devil's Doorway and I'm like, way. So, yeah, it just depends.
Yeah, it definitely does depend. And actually, you know, you brought up the TV show Them. I turned it off after the episode that you're talking about. I just, you know what, I'm not, like, that's not good for me right now. I just do not see that happening, which, you know, it usually takes a lot. So that's kind of testament to how it's a pretty brutal series. And what about you, Tim?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with everything that people have said about knowing yourself. I guess I would slightly extend it to say that involves being kind to other people as well, because everyone has their own crumble buttons and their own personal triggers. And so I know we're going to talk about the horror community in a bit more detail in a moment, but like, I think generally the horror community can be quite supportive, but there is like an element of gatekeeping that can exist where people are like, you're not a horror fan unless you like this. And I think actually being sympathetic and empathetic to each other, that actually what's fine for you, that's fine, I'm not taking that away, but for me, I don't want to watch this. I mean, the other thing I would say is that as much as I believe everything we've just said about the cathartic and therapeutic qualities of horror, there is an element of representation which is sometimes problematic in the genre. So for example, like one of the most famous horror films of all time is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which has a pejorative name as its title, you know, and it shows, oh yeah, Norman Bates is like cray cray and look what he's doing. It is kind of like it can be a lazy way of pathologizing people who are experiencing mental ill health. And there's an element where it kind of goes to the genre territory, but I think as we're kind of becoming more progressive as a society and we're kind of looking for equality along like gender lines, LGBTQ lines, ethnic lines, I think mental health is probably one of those other groups. So we want to be looking at it again, well, how, like, you know, things like Shyamalan's Split from a few years ago. It's a fine movie, but like it's also like, okay, so if you have this particular mental health disorder, you are in danger. And we know statistically, actually, if you have a mental health issue, you are more at risk of being a victim than a perpetrator of violence. But that's not what's represented on screen. It's far more often the other way around, where there's this pathological link between mental ill health and being dangerous. And I would just maybe suggest gently that that's a trope that should be continually broken down in genre cinema going forward over the next few years.
Oh yeah, it's you see it all the time that it's, you know, someone's got mental illness and it's like, well, now they're gonna go and now they're gonna go and kill everyone, which you know, is certainly not the case. And what about you, May?
This question is the one that I was most excited about, I have to say. And I'm so glad that you brought up the points you did, Tim, because I think along that same way. So in like working in the mental health field in the position that I do, the position is relatively new to have people who have mental health diagnoses coming in and being part of treatment for someone. And so obviously there are people in the mental health community, namely like psychiatrists and clinicians, who think more along the medical model. So they're thinking, okay, so the treatment for, you know, like I'm going to check this box and check this box, you fit into this box, and then treatment for that is this, this, and this. And then there's no treatment outside of that. And so one way that I illustrate to folks when I'm explaining to them why my role exists, I bring up the subject of horror movies and asylums and folks with mental illnesses in horror movies. And I said, okay, think about this trope and why it exists. It exists because it's based in reality. It exists because this is how we treated people. And it's horrific, not only that concept of the other, which is terrifying. And actually, Dolly, when you were talking about that outsider and that monster in the context of being queer, which I feel that in the context of being queer, but I also very much feel that in the context of having, you know, struggling with my mental health. And so when I'm explaining it to people, I'm just like, think about these films like Psycho, or think about, you know, the haunted asylum and the kind of imagery. So you see like a gurney with straps on it. That isn't a thing of the past. That's something that's happening right now. And so just being able to see that it's not necessarily the watching of it that's harmful, but it's the perpetuating that kind of view of people who have mental health or struggle with their mental health are insane. They're the other. We can't understand them. They're violent. So there's that side of it that I think. And then on the other side of it, I think specifically from a personal perspective. So my diagnoses are OCD and PTSD. So when my OCD was at its worst about a decade ago, one of the things that I couldn't do was watch horror films, because if I watched a horror film, I believed that it was tied to my moral integrity and that it meant that someone in my life would die. And so for me personally, I couldn't watch a horror film, and if I did, I would be spinning out of control mentally because of that cycle of obsessions and compulsions. So obviously, like, you know, if I was walking past a theater and there was a poster for a horror movie, I couldn't even look at it, because if I looked at it, it meant that I had some curiosity about it, and that was a moral failing, and therefore someone in my life was going to get hurt or die. OCD is wild, and I could talk about it all day. But yeah, so that's kind of like a roundabout way of saying, yes, I do think that horror can be detrimental to mental health for individuals and also for society and for what we're trying to achieve in the mental health field right now, which is more peer services and less of a medical model outlook where we're drugging people, and that overwhelmingly affects queer people and people of color. So yeah, I think that horror is tied to that intrinsically.
Yeah, I think, you know, you've all kind of picked up on the fact that, you know, as much as horror can be a comfort and an outlet, we need to take, you know, kind of personal looks at what we're okay with and what we're not okay with, and also, you know, find a way to support one another if someone says, actually, I don't find that to be a cathartic film. And just picking up on a comment I've seen on Facebook from Feral Punk, apparently there is a website called Does the Dog Die, which actually you can search films and episodes of TV, which they'll bring up specific triggers. And I think it's, you know, things like that that's obviously very helpful for us to be able to discover that. So thank you to Feral Punk for raising that. And kind of talking about like peers and, you know, all of that. Obviously here we all met through Twitter, which was amazing, you know, just kind of coming together. I want to talk a little bit about the horror community. You know, for me personally, it's been like an absolute lifeline. I've made, you know, friends for life. I've met, you know, many people, met Mal, you know, we even did a 5K race together, just small things like that. So I'd love to hear from you guys on how the horror community has or even hasn't, you know, what kind of support you've found and how you've utilized it. I'm gonna start with you, Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, I kind of feel like I should probably go later because I've got a sneaking suspicion that some of the gatekeeping stuff I mentioned might be along gender lines. I might be proved wrong. I don't know, but is it all right if I go a bit later on? I kind of want to hear what the women in the group will have to say first.
You absolutely can. All right, I'm going to throw it over to Lakaya.
Okay, yeah. So I think for me, especially when I found out that my research interests were definitely in horror cinema, even at uni and stuff, people were just like, why? Why horror? And like Tim was saying, I find it so honest in its approach in making you face your fears and reality. And when I joined Twitter and I found the horror like community, and I was like, oh my God, yay. It's so nice to find people that have similar interests to you. And, you know, even different opinions on like a particular horror film, and you can get different interpretations and stuff, because horror can be quite a niche genre to talk about with people not specifically interested in it. It's so nice with the click of a finger to be able to talk about it with so many other people. So yeah, like it's been really great for me for my research, for social reasons. Like I wouldn't have met all you guys. It's been really good for me, and I really like sharing my thoughts and opinions. And sometimes in person, I don't feel like I can do that because I suffer from really bad like social anxiety actually. But when it's over like Twitter or even like doing this, I find it so much easier for me to express things and speak to people rather than in person. So it's been amazing for me, and I'm really glad I've met you all too.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You know, that kind of like it is hard, you know, especially, I mean, you know, I met some work friends the other day and they started going, oh, what's that tattoo? And I was like, it's necromantic. And they were like, do you want to talk about that? Like, next question, please. Whereas, you know, on Twitter, I mentioned necromantic and everyone's like, oh, yeah, you know, I haven't watched it, or, you know, it's not my kind of movie, but cool. So it's, yeah, that you can definitely avoid the social anxiety and the awkwardness around things. Yeah. What about you, Jen?
I absolutely love the horror community, and I found a lot of like really welcoming people there, especially like it being in Nashville. Like, it's a very conservative town, and I remember watching The Loved Ones and desperate to talk about that with somebody, and nobody in my life had ever even heard of that movie. And so then I found this community. It's like, oh, you guys like this too? Like, this is, you understand me. And I think I had this really long honeymoon phase of like, these people are so amazing and I love everyone. And I have made a lot of wonderful friends. Some of my best friends I've met through Twitter. But I think the longer that I've been around, I have noticed a little more of the clickiness that is definitely present in the horror community. And I think it just, sometimes it does really kind of exacerbate my anxiety, you know, as much as I find comfort in being able to pause and nobody can see me think through a tweet and nobody can see me delete the part that, you know, I don't want to tweet, or I can just delete it on an alt account or something like that. I find a lot of comfort in that, but also like every person on the other end of an account is a human being too. And I find that sometimes I really want to depend on the horror community to support me in ways that I just don't think it's built to do, you know? And I think the times that I have felt kind of burned is when I think I'm really kind of putting the validation I'm looking for outside of myself. And I think about the reverse, like if somebody were depending on me to give them the like that they needed in that one moment, and I'm not online, like I can't control that. And so what am I expecting other people in this community to do for me? And it's just kind of something I'm figuring out. But it's been a realization that, yes, this is a wonderful community. I have found that it's been very welcoming, but it is still a community of human beings. And I just have to remember that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's, you know, I think I often go on there and I'm kind of expecting something, but you're right, you know, everyone on there is a human, and, you know, a lot of other people also dealing with things, and, you know, it's quite a complex thing, especially when it's a lot of it is done over social media. And, you know, what you said about the tweet thing, the amount of tweets I delete a day where I go, why would you, why are you posting that? And going back and deleting it, going, oh, Jesus Christ, what an idiot. Which, you know, at the end of the day, I'm sure no one really cares, but we do it anyway. What about you, Dolly?
I'm quite new to the online horror community. I've kind of been in my own little bubble, kind of more into the pin-up and cabaret and burlesque. And I never really let my freak fly too much until I entered this competition where it was called Mix Horror. So it was basically a horror pageant. And people kind of knew me as like a pin-up and cabaret and burlesque girl, so they weren't really expecting much. And then I came on stage as like a possessed mother and gave birth and pulled like the umbilical cord and placenta and then pretended to eat it. So everyone was pretty much like, oh, holy fuck, she is into horror. So that was like where I kind of felt like, okay, it's time to let that freak flag fly and let it all hang out. But it's only been within this past year during lockdown that I've kind of gone online with my horror obsession. I started my podcast through sheer boredom and just needing to talk to anybody apart from a 3-year-old. So I'm quite new to the online horror community, but like I've met so many amazing people. And like even just today, all of yous, and like looking at the comments, and I'm like, holy fuck, I'm not alone. Like I can connect with fellow freaks and it's great. And Yeah, I haven't. I mean, touching on Tim, you know, he touched on gender. I haven't seen too much gatekeeping. Maybe I'm just like, I'm really ignorant when it comes to that. I'm like, you know what, I'm just not going to listen to you if you're being, you know, misogynistic or something. But yeah, you all seem really nice and amazing. So, I mean, come back to me in a year and it could change, but you know.
Yeah. A little bit longer. And but you know, it's quite interesting what you're saying about you know, gatekeeping and gender. Kind of picking up on Tim's point as well, is I've certainly come into contact with people that I've gone, you can go in the bin, you're a piece of shit. But in general, like, not too much. And I think, you know, it also comes down to, I guess, a bit of, you know, personal filtering and kind of going,
Yeah,
this is who I'm going to interact with. This is, you know, these are the places I'm going to find that community, you know, and it varies across the internet. What about you, May?
Yeah, like Dolly, I'm fairly new to like seeking out the horror community. Like I've always loved horror movies, but I had been more in the mental health advocacy side of things, and only recently I started to kind of phase out of my role at my job and focus more on freelance writing. And so since then, which has been over the course of lockdown as well. So since then, you know, I've encountered, I guess, you know, I would call it just maybe not the most professional type of interactions from like larger publications. But in general, I think like small publications, like little like indie presses and things like that, people are so kind and so willing to just help and give advice and email, and they're just so open. But I think larger publications, maybe it's because they're kind of bogged down by pitches, or I don't know what it is, but I've definitely been subtweeted and it didn't feel good. And I think like for me, I like it feels even worse for some reason when it's a man, because I'm just like like who are you to say that? But you know what I mean. In general, I think that it's amazing, and I feel so fortunate to be a part of it. And I think it also depends on the media that you're like talking about or tweeting about, because for film and for books, it's incredible. But then if you have something bad to say about Resident Evil 8, they will come for you, and they will come hard, and I'm pretty sure that they're all men.
That's true. I've definitely, I think it was when I tweeted that it was my first time watching Rosemary's Baby, and some people were like, how can you be a horror fan if you haven't seen Rosemary's Baby? And I was like, I just haven't had time. I was like, there's so much to do in life. And, you know, also picking up on your point about, you know, larger publications, I think, you know, I've definitely found like smaller indie places that I've made, you know, much better connections or been given more chances. And I don't know what the reason is, you know, for some of those larger publications, but it does happen. It certainly does happen. And I think it's a shame, but, you know, I guess we keep flying that indie flag and all coming together, which is really nice. And Matt, I'm going to throw it over to you, because, you know, you're pretty involved in, like, you know, Fright Fest and some of the really London, UK based horror scenes. And that was kind of how I met you, like through community heavily in that. So how has it been for you?
For me, it's been life-changing, if I'm honest, because I struggled for years trying to find who I wanted to be. And growing up later in life through therapy, I realized that I was trying to seek validation in the wrong places. But throughout my life, I was just trying to validate who I was, and I was validating in the wrong places. And then every time I'd mention things like horror growing up as a kid, I'd get weird looks, and it was always like, well, you were a weirdo, you know, we can't hang out with you, kind of thing. And then when I found the horror community and everything else, I could just be me again, and I could just be who I wanted to be and not get judged for liking films that were really extreme, you know. And I've met, obviously I met you, Zoe, but I've met so many good friends that are friends that I can call upon for a drink, for a chat, you know, just like I said, we did the 5K, you know, those sort of things, because I can be myself around people and not get judged for, I don't know, like in the Serbian film, for example, you know, if I mention it to a person that's not a horror fan, they'd be like, "You feeling all right?" Whereas I'm like, "I think it's a good film, you know, I've only on Blu-ray kind of thing." So, you know, for me, it's that acceptance that I get from the horror community, which you don't always get from other people. I mean, I shared this talk at work, and everyone's fascinated about my obsession with horror. I'm like, for me, I get to be me. And I think that what happens, I think someone said earlier also, you get to be the person that you are, and the mental health side of you just sort of takes a back step, because it's all like all those anxieties about trying to fit in, trying to sort of be in a certain group. You don't have to be that way. You can just be yourself. I go to the festivals, you know, somebody recommend a film, like, yeah, you get me, you know why I like that film. So for me, that's where I find that comfort. I do agree with some parts about, I think Jen made the point about clickiness. There is clicks somewhere around that, but that's with all walks of life, wherever you're going to be. So that's just part and parcel of the game, I think. But for me, it's been, like I said, it's just been refreshing just to be able to be me. And I think the last 5, 6, maybe 10 years now, I've just changed as a person because of it, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, you know, just getting to, like you said, you know, not getting judged for liking a Serbian film is so nice. It's like, I like that movie, and I don't have to be like, oh, well, you know, there's definitely more to it than what you think. What about you, Tim? Your wish is my command. You love
Oh, thank you. No, I was really pleased and happy to hear that everyone's experiences were on the whole positive, because mine have been as well overwhelmingly positive. Like I love the horror community. I think my experience has been, it's been very accepting and very inclusive and very diverse and pro diversity. The slight caveat, I guess, would be so for instance, I moderate on a mid-size horror Facebook group, and the issues that I have had a moderator have been from white men, and I say that as a white cisgender straight guy. And so I guess I would just say, as I think the horror community is great, but like that comment that it is still just a group of people, so like intersectional differences still exist, and the power imbalances and the some of the oppressions still cut through like it does with any other group. And I think, you know, it's just being mindful of that it's not a panacea which is immune from having to deal with those issues ourselves. I think on the whole, though, it's been more accepting than, air quotes, mainstream society.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, fuck mainstream society. We've got our little weirdo gang, which is, you know, and I mean, it's been amazing, you know, like being able to bring you guys together to talk about like mental health and horror. Like that wouldn't be possible without the community. So for me, you know, I recognize there's definitely some negatives, but mainly positives. So I'm conscious of time, and I think, you know, we'll start to wrap things up, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm starving. So my kind of last question to you all is, what is the most comforting thing about fear and horror for you? Let's start with Mal.
As I said, I think it says at the start, for me, it just throws everything on the screen, and it plays it out in front of me. I don't read as many horror books as I should, to be fair, but the films just, here's all the horror, and I find comfort and peace in that. And for me, it's almost like, trying to think, a cathartic relationship, because I can read through things or see through things on the screen, which help me process the way I'm feeling. Going back to the point, I think the other question was about, you know, how you are feeling on the day. There are some films where I just want to see someone just get obliterated, whereas other days I just want to see a film where, you know, someone's mentally being broken down and you can see their change in their life, and those things help me. So that's where my comfort lies. Like I saw Run the other day for the first time after a bad day, and Run just was like, yeah, I needed to see this at this time of day. I'm in that sort of frame of mind for this sort of film. So I think I don't get that with other genres. You know, action films are action films. You say rom-coms I don't really watch. So for me, it's these sort of films that sort of work at various ways depending on how I'm feeling. So for me, that's where the comfort is in all essences, really.
Definitely. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, I think it's a comment that May made earlier that sometimes like horror movies are just fun, right? It's like it's a really hackneyed phrase, but like the roller coaster of getting the emotional high. Like, you know, horror, like comedy, it kind of elicits an involuntary reaction. Like, you know, good comedy should make you laugh, and good horror should make you jump and feel uncomfortable. I get, for me personally, it's kind of like there's that story, isn't there, that John Carpenter, when he saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, took the Tobe Hooper movie, said that it terrorized him to the edge of what he could take, and then he went home and slept like a baby. And for me, that kind of like sums it up. Like, I personally come to horror because I want to think about life in all of its richness, right? So I want to like look in the face of all the difficulties that are there and have like an honest confrontation with it. And like, with my background, like pre-academia, working with vulnerable groups, like people don't want to talk and think about how messed up the world is for a lot of people. Like the levels of sexual violence that are happening are astronomical. The levels of, like, my background was in refugee work, so I used to work with people coming to the UK from other countries who had seen the most appalling things, and that's not on the radar for most people. So actually, horror for me is about like, actually, I want to think about that stuff because I want to honestly process what's happening in the world. So things like Remy Weeks' His House was a fantastic film from last year in that regard. Yeah. So for me, it is that honesty. I want to see the world as it is, not how I would have it, and then I want to be able to find a way of engaging with that and finding a way of processing it healthily.
Absolutely. What about you, Lakea?
I think for me, why I enjoy horror so much as well is it literally just helps me face my fears, but through the censorship of the TV or the laptop. And it's easier to process and take in. And then like by the end of the film, it's like, yeah, like the demon is conquered. And you just feel a liberation and a relief, right? Like at the end of a horror film. And like Tim says, you sleep like a baby. So it's just like that build up and then just the release watching the film, and it's very cathartic and comfortable for me. And I honestly think, weirdly, it's like one of the most comforting genres. So yeah, it's great.
You said that much more succinctly than I was able to, Lakaya.
But it does. It's almost like, you know, it's kind of like being exercised, isn't it? You just like get it all out there. What about you, May?
So when I was going through OCD treatment and going through treatment just for anxiety and PTSD in general, one of the things that I was taught to do was, you know, my brain would come up with some horrific things that were probably going to happen, like in my mind. Like for me, one was like my partner is going to die in a car accident on his way home. And so I was trained to kind of be like, okay, what if that happened? And then what then? And what's the next step? And what do you do? And so for me, the comfort in horror is that it's the most outrageous, horrible things that people can come up with. And in my mind, it's kind of like revisiting that, okay, what if that happened? What would you do next? Kind of thing. And it just helps me confront the fact that so many of my anxieties, while, you know, obviously a car accident could happen, but so many of my anxieties aren't really based in reality. And I think that is the comfort in horror films for me, because I'm looking at it, I'm anxious, I'm scared, but there's a comfort in knowing that it's safe.
Yeah, the safety is, I mean, the safety is the safety. That's, yeah, absolutely. What about you, Dolly?
For me personally, I am such a highly creative person, and I'm not happy if I'm not creating. And horror for me is where I am the most creative. And, you know, I draw a lot. I'm burlesque dancer, as I said. Most of my routines are horror based. I love creating clothes, and it's all just like based on horror. And I just find that when I'm watching horror, when I'm reading horror, when I'm watching a TV show that's horror, it's like my creative juices just get flowing, and it's like a rush of creative endorphins, and it's like a little high, because I'm watching someone else's creation and I'm like, fuck, I could do that too. And, you know, I want to go make a short film, or I want to go make a dress based on this, or an act or something. So it's like this little, it's like a kid's painting room inside my head. And that's where I go when I watch horror.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the amount of times I watch horror, I'm like, oh, I've got an idea on my phone, like random stuff. And finally, Jen, what about you?
I think that horror, what it really has given me over the years is just, it's helped me feel like I'm not alone. You know, I think Tim mentioned earlier, like we are just really averse to talking about pain and showing pain and talking about trauma. And I think horror has helped me see people that have been through things that I have been through. And I watch like rape revenge films and I think, okay, somebody else, you know, and I wrote, like, the other part that it gives me, I think, is it takes the feelings that I have, and I have no clue if I'm in the right part of my brain, but it takes it out of the feeling part of my brain and it activates it and helps me move it into the processing part, which releases it. And it helps me. And it takes a long time, but like, that's why I don't just like to watch horror. I want to talk about it and I want to write about it. And I want to try to like write and then piece those words together in a way that helps me process everything in my head. And I joke with my therapist, like I've lost count of how many horror movies I've spoiled for her, because I am she doesn't watch the genre. So she's always like, okay, it's okay. You can tell me what happens at the end of The Shining. But I'm constantly like, oh, and I feel like this, and I feel like this. And it helps me to see it in someone else. Because some of the things that are just really hard to talk about when it's you, and it's taken me a long time to get to a point where I can talk about things that have happened to me, but I can talk about something I saw in like MFA, you know, I can talk about that movie, and then it helps me get to a point where I can talk about it with me. So that's what it's given me. And it's really changed my life. And, you know, I'm not going to get emotional.
No, you're, I mean, absolutely right. And, you know, a few people in the comments as well said that they found it so difficult to be able to verbalize their feelings. And through horrors, you know, the same, you know, with my therapist, she often uses horror analogies to describe, you know, things that I'm finding difficult to communicate. And I go, yes, I'm like, it is the monster that's upstairs in the attic. I'm like, you've nailed it there. And I think, you know, that is the amazing thing about horror, is it does, you know, have so much to do with mental health, which is why I think, you know, just saying it, definitely the superior genre. No offense to anyone else. But thank you so much to all of you for coming on today and talking so openly and honestly about, you know, your love for horror and also how that plays into mental health. It has been amazing to hear from you all, and you know, just from the comments alone, everyone has really, you know, resonated and found this important. So I'm going to let you all go in a second. I just really want to quickly run around and get you all to just say where people can find you and follow you, so that, you know, after this they can follow all your work, etc. So Lakaya?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. My art is just Lakaya P. That's it at the moment, as I'm fairly new, but I'm hopefully going to be writing some articles for some different places soon. So if I do, they will be linked to my Twitter. Awesome.
Jen?
You can find me at Jen Ferratu on all of the different socials. And you can find me on the Psychoanalysis podcast, where we talk about a lot of the same things that we've been talking about today. At PsychoAPod is our handle on socials.
Perfect. Tim?
So my personal Twitter is at Fats Coleman, FATSCOLEMAN, or come over and check out movingpicturesfilmclub.com, and that's also on Twitter at movingpixclub.
Perfect. Mal?
Yeah, so I'm Mal Jutley on all social media. So and I write a part-time mental health blog as well, which is linked to my Twitter, which you'll find a link for as well. But yeah, that's me really.
Perfect. Dolly?
I'm on Twitter, what_scream. My podcast is What a Scream on Facebook and Instagram. And then if you want to follow my personal Instagram, it's at oh golly, it's Miss Dolly. There we go.
And May?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at MayMurrayXO. And you can also subscribe to my newsletter at maymurray.net.
Amazing. Well, thank you all. Thank you to everyone that has tuned in to watch. Obviously, this was, I was hosting it, of course, by Ghouls Magazine. You can head over to our website. We've got some amazing articles, some from Jen, some upcoming as well from some of the guests here. I won't spoil anything, but we do have lots. We've also got a bit of a promotion on our Ghouls Gang membership for 50% off, so do check that out. And yeah, make sure you come and follow Ghouls Magazine on all of our socials, and I will also make sure that these people's links are everywhere. I'll put them everywhere so you can find everyone. So yeah, again, thank you so much, guys, and yeah, I hope to see you all soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.